Great, done. Yeah, yeah, finally. I hate using it without a mouse, and great. So I'm ready now. Yeah, so I should. Okay, great, brilliant.
Are you open?
No, because I'm not the next speaker, am I?
No, you're not, but you're...
It is open, yeah. So
okay.
it's well, sorry, it's here.
Okay.
I just want to check that this is... Oh. No, it's not working.
I'm wondering...
Okay, he said
it...
it...
that's not running off that laptop.
Oh, okay, all right. Brilliant. Okay, then. But it should change here, though, shouldn't it? Sorry, should this...
You're not in presentation mode.
Yeah, this...
Oh, yeah.
We want to present this one, yes?
So yeah.
Well, actually, he's not next.
I'm not next, no.
Right, but this presentation that's up there is next.
Right, so when I go into presentation mode, it will then... This will
that's
work.
it.
We'll bring this one back, and now when you're in... Okay, let's escape out of this.
That seems to be...
Yeah, it's the right presentation. I just want to make sure it's actually live. There we go.
Good.
Oh,
but it's not changing on the screen, though, is
okay.
It? Oh, because it's not in presentation mode again, as you say.
Yeah.
And will you be in here when Mike comes to mind?
Of course.
Okay, great.
And just one note. So that the broadcast can see when you use the laser pointer, if you use this one, they'll see it in the broadcast as well.
Oh, okay, that's good. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, I'll do that then. Yeah, great. That is better than that. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, thanks.
All right, welcome back. I think that was a great landscape set this morning. Fortunately, one of the joys of having large breaks is we can contract and stay on schedule. One thing, the conversation after John's session was, and Bonnie and I were talking about this during the break, that was kind of a Q&A, which is great, but we didn't get around to sort of action items or things for the working group. We will have a good chunk of time this afternoon to engage in that conversation as well. So, that was a great conversation after John's talk, and I don't want to minimize that. But I do want to focus on keep reminding people that this discussion, we'd like to provide an opportunity to kind of think about and reflect on how what was discussed could get implemented, or what are some of the problems, some of the actions that could be drawn out from these presentations and where we can go from there. So think about that in the context of John's talk. I was taking some notes, and I know several others were, about things that the interest group can do based on John's talk. So just keep that in mind as we're kind of moving through through the presentations for the rest of the day. So kind of moving things along, the next speaker on the agenda is Micah Altman, who is Director of Research and Head Scientist, the Program of Information Sciences at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's also part of one of the projects that I mentioned in terms of things taking place in the wider world regarding some of these issues. He's involved in the Privacy Tools for Sharing Research Data project. I think that's run by Harvard, or a joint project with Harvard and MIT. Joint project, and a few others. So Micah is going to be talking about issues around anonymization, which is something that John touched on as well. So Micah.
Good morning, everyone. I hail from the MIT libraries now. I'm a reformed computer science, reformed to be a social scientist, reformed to be an information scientist and librarian. So that's my gory history. The standard disclaimer is don't blame any of the stakeholders. And also, if you like anything that I say, it probably has a lot to do with both our funders and my excellent colleagues. But don't blame them for anything that it hasn't been affixed to paper because, or given the stamp of authority, because they have not reviewed these slides and notes. So, talk mostly about privacy, utility, and use and the way that anonymization affects them. Let's start a little bit with information privacy, just terms for this talk and concepts, and end with some thoughts about calibrating protection to risks. So people use these terms in all sorts of different ways, and I'm part of a number of interdisciplinary research projects. We've got legal scholars and statisticians and computer and scientists in cryptography and in automated policy design, and social scientists, and they all have pretty precise definitions of privacy, and they don't match. So just be aware when you're talking about privacy or confidentiality, et cetera, that even if you have a precise definition, it might not be the one that someone else is precisely using. In the way that I will use it in this talk and that we are trying to use it in our interdisciplinary projects, privacy is more widely, it's not just about sharing anonymized data or non-anonymized data, but it's about what happens before data collection, during data collection, storage, and after it's released into the world that affects people's control over their information and what others, how it's gathered from them and what other people might learn about them from it. Which is confidentiality, which is the protection of information within a system. Disclosure is an important part of it, but it's not the whole part. And generally, it interacts with things like identifiability, what can you learn from that information, and what are the consequences of that information being misused, which is often called sensitivity. I would like to say that privacy is not about anonymization, and as My recommendation is that you use terms like anonymization, de-identification, PII, formally as legal concepts, where within the particular framework of a particular law or regulatory context, there are particular requirements for data treatment. Because mathematically, there are no strong connections to any of these concepts. It's not clear from a statistical point of view when something is anonymous or de-identified or what's PII. So these are really legal concepts, and I will keep that in mind. Privacy is also not information security. Information security, the goal of information security is to maintain a lot of different properties within an information system, right? One of those properties is confidentiality or secrecy, and certainly if the secrecy of information gets in the wrong hands, that can violate privacy. But it's not everything that information security does, and there's a lot of ways that people's privacy can be violated without.
Excuse me, Micah, it's okay if you move around? I just want to,
I'll give you.
I'll give you, no, I want to give you this, because
Yeah,
you're
you want to
fading
mic
in.
me up.
Mic you up, so you're fading in and out.
All right. See, if I don't move around, either I go to sleep or everybody else does, or both, and that's not such a good thing. So the aim, the ultimate aim of managing privacy is to prevent some harm from learning about people, disclosure of individual information because of their participation in some data. Right? And that harm may be to individual subjects, to vulnerable groups, to institutions or society. And and a final caution, public data isn't, not always. Hey, how many people have Googled themselves? All right. How many people don't admit to Googling themselves? Well, most of you. Well, if you've ever Googled yourself, have you ever seen something like this come up, like check, criminal record check on Micah Altman? Have you ever seen, but we're suspicious characters. The rest of you may not be suspicious characters, but I've gotten that check. This illustrates a problem with public data. Now, mugshots and arrest records, not convictions, but arrest records, they're public information, they're public records. Under most state laws, completely public. Anyone has a right to use them for whatever purpose. Everybody knew that, right? It used to be, 15 years ago, that were public records, and you could go down to the Broward County Courthouse on, Thursday afternoon, and you ask for some name, because how else are you going to find a particular record, and pay copying costs and get some of these things. Well, now things are being digitized, right? And digitization and APIs make aggregation discovery easy. And even neglecting the things that weren't really public, but were there anyway, like social security numbers scrawled in the margins. All of that stuff, even if they catch all of that stuff, all the stuff that was really supposed to be public is now available everywhere. And so this creates a new business model, which is aggregate up all of the arrest records, now place ads on people's names, and when their embarrassing photo comes up, get them to pay for a reputation management service. We'll take your mugshot down for a small maintenance fee. So, in response, many people said, well, wait a minute, we knew these were public, but maybe these aren't so public. They were public for one context, but we didn't know they were going to be used for another context. And the response is that there's a sector-by-sector reaction. And within the last 2 years, 11 states have passed laws specifically that regulate mugshot database. Does this protect any of the other data that's lost its context? No. It's just about mugshots. But this is the environment we're in, where things that seem public, or that people thought of as not really public, really were legally, but might not be soon. Worth paying attention to. So let's be more specific. Now, I'll talk about privacy, utility, and research uses for most of this. And there's a sort of no free lunch theorem that's come out of computer science work and cryptography work around protecting privacy in the last decade or so. And that basically says any data analysis that is useful, any analysis of data that allows you to learn something that is truthful, might be with uncertainty, but is truthful in aggregate about some aggregate property of the population. What's the average age of people? It reveals a little something, a little knowledge about every individual in it. Maybe not a lot, right? It doesn't necessarily provide your age with certainty, but you update a little bit more because you were in that database. It's never zero, and there's no free lunch. And so the trade-off that we're going to need to make is to say how much of this privacy, this information that you think of as yours, are we giving away to learn a lot about some more useful aggregate property of the system? We want that to be, there's always a trade-off. We want that to be the best trade-off we can make, to get the most utility from the amount of privacy we're spending. Now, this comes from an increasingly sophisticated understanding of privacy. You might say, look, privacy is just about linking to people. There's no way from an average age that I can link to you. And that's true, right? It will not, having some calculations in aggregate don't provide any additional or record linkages, don't establish a record linkage. And so they would still be anonymous under the law, for example. But in the science of privacy, we've gone from an understanding of privacy as where is Waldo, or wherefore art thou record 13x9, to what can we learn about you based on this information. If I might be able to learn from a data release that you're in a set of 50 people who have committed crimes, I don't know which record you are, but I know you're somewhere in there. So I've learned a fact about you. Or maybe I've only learned a probabilistic fact about you, that you, based on your participation in the data, I now know that you have 3 times the risk of blood cancer as usual. Right? You're 3 times more likely to have that because you participated in data collection. That would be a learning event. And those are inescapable if we learn anything useful, but we try to manage them. So we manage them based on use. And privacy is often paired as utility, defined broadly as analytic value of the data, but there's no universal operational definition. New computational methods can help us. There are some approaches to measuring utility, statistical approaches like measuring the variance of an estimate, right? So if we have a cluster of estimates, maybe they're noisy, but altogether they're in the right ballpark. Privacy techniques are always going to add some uncertainty to an estimate. It's never as precise as you're going to get with the full data. But you want to reduce the uncertainty you're adding, and you want to avoid bias where you're more precise. You think it's in some area. You're getting a cluster of things that are in a different area than it should be. There are other things like maintaining truthfulness. If there's a record that says that there's a doctor that's 70 years old, can we infer that there's really a doctor that's 70 years old in the data? That may be important for some analytic purposes to know that statement, even if not as exact as the statement in the original data, is literally true or is complete. And then there's measures of things like entropy, how much information in the data, the difference between having an ordered brick wall and a pile of bricks. The challenge is that utility may not track quality or value, because quality depends not only on these properties, but on what the intended use of the data is. And value depends not only on what the intended use is, but on unanticipated uses and markets and other institutions. And also, you can perform these calculations at different levels. You could say, we have a truthful measure. Does that mean that your aggregate quantity will be an unbiased estimate? Sort of, no. Right. So statements about measures don't necessarily imply the similar statements about models or about the whole data. So the traditional approach to anonymization, to statistical disclosure limitation or de-identification, is to take some data, to mess with it in some way, either by adding noise or removing pieces of it or switching it around. And you mess with it until it reaches some concept of privacy, which might be this Where's Waldo concept, or it might be a k-anonymity. There's no groups, no individual unique records with unique identifying characteristics. There's at least 3 with every public characteristic, or some more sophisticated model of learning. And then you could apply that at the data level or an analysis level. And you emit those results in some form as a statement, as a picture, as a data set, as a table. And so here's an example of some data. It's, of course, evil. It's got sensitive information, undiscovered twins, unexpected responses, and so we mess it up with perturbation, with noise and suppression and aggregation. And it doesn't look the same, but this is K2 anonymous, so there's no record with a publicly identified, well-known public identifier. It's impossible to have, based on well-known public identifiers, a unique record linkage. We've masked all the PII. So this, under a lot of standards, this is legally acceptable. Doesn't prevent you from learning some interesting stuff. And its usefulness for analysis may be interesting. Now, there is perfect privacy, which is this. It's known as global tabular suppression. But it also has perfect utility reduction. And these things, these techniques, like all of the components for messing up the data, and regardless of whether what privacy concept you're using, record linkage or k-anonymity or differential privacy, they're all using the same primitives to manipulate the data. All of these have some effect on the properties that we talked about. All of them affect variance and information complexity, and a lot of them affect bias, precision, truthfulness, completeness, consistency, or interpretability of the data. And so one has to be careful because different methods of arriving at the same privacy, same legal requirement will give you different utility for different purposes. Now, there are some special challenges. These are generic statistical frameworks. There are special challenges for particular research uses. And there are different sorts of uses that we do in research. One taxonomy is to think of them as data integration, data reuse, and things around verification. So data integration might include pooling, or it's pooling in various ways. We might say, let's take measures, people who are measured in this database, and people who are measured on the same people who are measured in some other characteristics, and bring them together so that we can compare these measures. Medical record systems do that. That's known as vertical integration. We might pool subjects, say we measured the same things, but in different populations, different samples, and we want to have a larger pool of subjects so that our analysis is better. Pooling results from different analyses to see how much we should trust the findings, whether it's a particular research finding or the effectiveness of a drug intervention, and pooling over time. And there's also pooling over time with the future, going out and finding those same subjects and extending measures on them. Data reuse is more limited. Taking that same data set and either extending it or critiquing it, reanalyzing it, by saying maybe you should use estimating a new model or a new estimate. Sometimes what we'd like to do is take that data set and extract new measures from it. So what are some of the challenges? Well, horizontal integration, right? Just having bigger pools, more measures of the same subjects on the same, more measures of more subjects, same measures, that's probably the easiest thing to do. Privacy, these techniques don't affect that any more than any other utility. But you do have to make sure that you know what the samples were from which population, so you're not counting the same people twice or 3 times. And so that requires more provenance, more metadata, and thinking ahead. However, most of the other privacy protections can impede integrating across measures. So if you have different databases that describe different factors of those people, integrating over time, or doing meta-analysis. You can do limited meta-analysis just on the study results, which is what the standard Cochrane reviews do. But if you want to do a full meta-analysis, the more data you have, the more reliable it's going to be. And anonymization impedes follow-up studies. And there's some mitigating approaches, like tiered access, third-party escrow, artificial linking identifiers, which have their own challenges, and secure multi-party computation. For reuse, the methods that impede data integration can also sometimes impede critiques or extensions or new questions. If I want to extend someone's result, sometimes that involves adding to their model something that they didn't measure. Right? Well, you didn't control. The modal peer review comment is, did you control for this factor? At least in social science. Well, you can't extend the model to control from that factor if you can't link the data across factors. Synthetic data approaches or generalization or suppressing measures can impede new questions. For example, I was the archival director for a mixed method archive for years. We had video. It was used for decades. What was really used was the transcript. Who said what to whom? Now we know that we could go and extract voice tone and emotion. We could look at face. We might be able to get pulse rates on some people. We might be able to get indications of Parkinson's. So there are measures that were in that data that we never even knew existed. And if you use synthetic data techniques or your generalization, you may prevent the extraction of those unanticipated measures. Again, broad consent to research, tiered access, where you keep the original data around but have higher and higher levels of restriction to get at more detailed data. And finally, replication verification. And this is very much in the news, but there are a lot of different reasons for this. When I talk to the vice president for research office, they're really concerned. They're getting a elevated number of allegations of research misconduct, because it's really easy to mine databases and find anomalies and figures and things in tables and say, all right. They're not finding more misconduct, but they have to deal with more and more re-examination of the research process. They don't care whether the result is right. They don't care. It's not a meta-analysis. This is the opposite of meta-analysis. They don't care whether this drug is good for you on the whole, whether 12 other studies contradict it. They want to know that what you did is and published in the paper corresponds to what you actually did. That's all, right? And so that's one reason to do a replication, is to do a validity check. It may be to detect some errors in practice. We may use this for process evaluations. I did studies on numerical stability of software. A lot of cutting edge at the time, statistical software was not doing so well. But without access to the actual data, you couldn't see how fragile the estimates were. So that's another reason to need the actual precise data that was used to see how robust particular methods were. When you're starting a replication or a critique or an extension, often you want to check that you understand the analysis done. One of the ways to check that is to redo it and make sure you get the same results. Then you feel confident. You've established that you actually know what they're doing and can extend it. It's very embarrassing to critique somebody, extend the risk, and figure out that you did something completely different. And for historical analysis, for legal verification, you may want to be able to verify with certainty that a particular fact pattern existed. So there are, again, these different sorts of anonymization techniques affect different purposes for replication. Most will make it a little harder to verify. Some will make it hard to calibrate. Some will be hard to verify historical statements. So again, approaches like mitigating, like tiered access, consent for replication, privacy-aware publishing, where you could publish your research, your final research, based on the post-protected data, checking that it was consistent substantively. That will also encourage you not to report too much precision or too little uncertainty. But if you didn't do that, and somebody is trying to replicate based on post-process data, they'll probably get a different result. And finally, big data creates a number of additional research challenges. And the evidence base in social science is shifting over. A lot of the high impact papers are based on data that didn't come from going out and surveying 100 people, but from collecting the cell phone logs of millions of people, or billions of eBay transactions, or Twitter posts, or Facebook. And this can be especially surprising. You may be doing a topic analysis, and so take a set of Facebook posts and extract topics from them. And for replicability, you release them. You remove all the personal identifiers. But perhaps they can be re-identified through stylometric analysis, through analysis of writing style. You didn't know that. Right? That was not part of a standard de-identification technique, and it wasn't part of the measures that you were expert in. You weren't doing stylistic analysis. You were doing topic analysis, so you had no idea about these measures lurking in the data. The same with the Murray video data and Parkinson's. We had no idea. As we get thicker data, there's more and more there that could be extracted. And so we either have to really dumb it down, or we have to realize that there may be all sorts of measures there that have individual characteristics that we didn't think of. Further, observable behavior leaves a fingerprint. If I know where you were, what state you were on, for 7 days in a row, what county you were in 7 days in a row, I can separate you from a whole crowd of people. If I knew to the nearest mile where you were every 4 hours for the next 3 days, I could pin that down to you. Even completely different measurements on a completely different set of days, right? Because your behavior habits mostly are repeated. So your migration habits, your commuting patterns, they fingerprint you. So do things like your credit card transactions, which stores you shop at, right? And since a lot of data can be, big data is making things much more externally observable. It's not just protecting about privacy in the context of your study, it's protecting it in the context of what's out there in the world, right? Based on what's in the world, I can find data. And also, some traditional methods like suppression can totally destroy the utility of some big data research. For example, movie rankings. Like if we ask what people's favorite summer blockbuster is, or 3 favorites in order, we'll get a lot of the same responses. If we ask people, everybody in this hotel, what their 3 favorite obscure movies are, and the order, totally different ranking. Everyone will be unique. So if we suppress every record so that there are no unique records, we'll suppress everything, right? Or we'll suppress all the tails of everything, which is where some of the really interesting stuff happens. So there are now a number of computational methods that go beyond messing up and reducing the data, right? And they offer different sorts of complementary controls, which are part of managing privacy. Controlling access to data, and virtual data enclaves are one example, where as part of a tiered access model, you might have more rich data available. You make it available within a virtual environment that's managed and vetted and audited. And so it's not perfect protection, but it gives you more legal and process protections than handing out the data. You can use cryptography to control the computations. And things like secure multi-party computation, functional encryption, homomorphic encryption, blockchain, they're all about either allowing certain computations but not others to be performed without necessarily access to the data. I can agree that a system will give me a result. It can compute across a dozen different sources. No one has to share their data with the other source, but the result will be right. And the result is only the estimate that we agree on. And we can prove we did it. So those secure computations are useful if you can express what you need to do in terms of computation. They don't control what you can infer from the data about people. So you still have to think about, based on what's being computed, what could I learn about people? Differential privacy is an example of statistical and computational methods to control the total learning. And then there are some legal areas where you not only want to control computation and inference, but what the use of that data is. How is that used? You may use this data, you may use this inference for research, but not for housing decisions. And there are things like automated policy languages that can help with that, though they're in very early stages. A warning is that no current method really addresses a big emerging problem, which is algorithmic discrimination. So remember when we Googled ourselves and Christine and I got this job ad? This criminal background check ad with a mugshot. It turns out that at least during a period of time, that ad was appearing most often when somebody Googled black names. So what do you think? There was the entrepreneurs who make the extortion database. Are they racist? Yes? Yes? No? What's going? Did they buy? So the first theory was they bought. You have to go to AdWords, right? If nobody finds your extortion, then you can't make any money off of it. So in order to find your extortion business model, you have to place a Google ad, and so you place ads based on words, on names. So we figured, or LaTanya Sweeney, Harvard, figured, well, whose work it is, and I should cite her, thought probably they bought up black names. No. They bought up all the last names. They didn't buy any first names. Google AdWords optimizes based on click-through rates. They just learned that people were much more interested on clicking ads for mugshot databases and learning about the criminal history of black people. That was just more successful. So it took all of those implicit biases, behavioral biases we have, and concentrated them. This is one of the
This is an algorithmic problem that in some sense is divorced from privacy. Right? You could anonymize the data so that we don't link to any individual person, and this would still happen. In fact, none of this data linked to anybody. But this is one of the reasons that people are really concerned with maintaining their information privacy, is so that they are not discriminated against based on their characteristics. And so in one sense, this is central to how people control their information and what happens with it. And we do not have good solutions here. So some 2 minutes of advice. Good news and bad news. De-identification is not enough, but large numbers can be our friend, especially with new methods. We shouldn't think just about what do we do before we disclose the data once and for all, but about baking privacy in. This has been part of privacy principles for the last 15 years. But it's important to actually make that into engineering principles now. Notice and consent by itself does not scale. So when you add more things, you're going to need a variety. On the issue of notice and consent, most people believe that they've lost control of their information, at least most people surveyed in the US. And this is for business information, not government information. But they don't understand the consequences of what's shared. So they may say, I'm perfectly happy with sharing my location to get better advertising, but have no idea that it is being collected historically. I just wanted you to know my location then. But every time, when you opt in for that, it's kept, right? And one of the reasons is because privacy policies are embedded in terms of use, which are long. People encounter thousands of terms of use every year. If you spent your time reading them, it would be a whole work month every year just to read terms of use. So nobody does that. And increasingly, it says, we're going to use this data for whatever we want, because big data is surprising. One of the things about big data is it's rich, so the uses are hard to anticipate. So consenting to all future uses is not very scalable. Instead, having a life cycle approach, using a range of privacy controls, and attempting to calibrate the sets of controls to both how much one can learn from that data about individuals and what sort of damage it might do. Right? If there's negligible risks from it, or it's been protected with rigorous de-identification techniques, you might release it with just some terms of service. If it's much more risky data, if it's only legal de-identification has been concerned, you may consider more stronger procedural protections, for example. And so if you're looking for further information or just have insomnia, you can take a look at some of the work we've done that summarizes some of the range of these issues and privacy controls. And again, all credit for the good ideas go to my colleagues, and for any mistakes that are not in those papers to me. Questions?
I'm Shay Swagger from Auraria Library,
Hey.
and both you and John talked about sort of the dynamic and evolving nature of privacy and technology. So I'm wondering what the obligations of researchers are retroactively, if they've done everything that they knew of to protect privacy, it was baked in, it was thoughtful, but down the line, new technology comes out, and you can ask new questions. Do they then have to go back and rethink through privacy of all of the data that they've collected in the past? And then how does that work moving forward for researchers?
So when we talk about obligations and duties, it's critically important to distinguish between legal obligations and ethical obligations. And it's, and I'd say you need to look both ways, right? So it's not, you consider the scenario where something new comes up, but also when you're planning for the research, think about what downstream uses are and how they might change. Most IRB consent agreements that I've seen and that we've collected say nothing about replication. That's very new, right? You could think that that's one of the legitimate uses of the research for sharing the research data is that it will be used to replicate, verify the results. And so maybe that should be in the consent. And we've seen examples where people have not put that in, and so now the IRB, well, you have to go and get permission to, for that new use. So if you comply with the current regulatory framework, as a researcher, generally you're not exposed to a lot of risk from things that you have previously published, right? Things that you have previously shared based on changes in the law. If you're an institution and you maintain ongoing access to data, for example, or if you are in your research and you are continuing to add to that research data, continuing that research activity, as risks change, you may be, practically, there's not a mechanism for where the IRB will say, or the regulator will say, hey, we've detected this new risk. But you are supposed to alert the IRBs of substantial new risks associated with research. That's part of the formal obligation. And certainly if a data breach law comes into effect that says the penalty for releasing data with a name and a social security number is $10,000 per incident, if you're an institution that's serving data, you're going to worry about that. You're on the hook, even if it complied with previous standards for redacting for FERPA or IRBs or whatever it was, because we live in a very diverse sectoral legal environment. As a researcher, I think one's obligation should be to think about reuse, the value of, that one has an ethical obligation to think about the value of reuse and to think about the risks to subjects. I don't think that, and as one's understanding of risks change or values change, to think about that. But, you know, you have limited efficacy once, certainly when research studies are over and the like. Other questions? Well, I have explained everything. Okay. Yeah.
I'm not really sure how relevant connected it is, but that's my question. Do you find that the way that these data are aggregated and so on is influencing the so-called filter bubble? So also the information that is passed through and that people obtain, and how this can affect the research?
So this is the filter bubble is fundamentally connected to algorithmic discrimination. Right? It's classifying and predicting on an individual basis, giving individualized results based on what you infer about them. If we do it for legitimate reasons, it might be we tailor your search results. You know, tailor our services, our products and services to you. Arguably, I know one foundation VP who argues that somewhat joking, that the NSA would never have gotten such bad press if it just used the information it collected to tailor its products and services. If you could call the NSA and say, I dropped my laptop, can you give me a copy, or could I have those meeting notes? You know, it would be the world's best minutes, right? So we don't seem to object to, often don't object when it's working for us. When it's working for somebody else, or to our disadvantage, or to the disadvantage of a population that is already established as disadvantaged, then we think that's a problem. They're the same algorithms, and so there is a question about how to control how we use people's information in aggregate to make in combination with individual decisions. And right now, if you do a standard training algorithm for classification, you get a 3% error, classification error. That would be great, often, right? Oh, we're recommending the right thing 3% of the, 97% of the time. I'm fuzzing the concept, being imprecise with the concept. But if you learn that those 3% were all, the 3% you got wrong were all the low-income people who came to your site, would that be disturbing? Right? No? But there's no mechanism to systematically check for that. And I think that's part of real information, giving people real information control, is understanding how it's used and how it will affect them and building that into the systems, including these recommendation systems. Yeah.
So the whole thrust of your talk was that effectively you couldn't anonymize irreversibly and still keep the utility of the data. That was
You will learn something.
Yeah,
yes.
but not everything. So my question was, who do you think should keep that not anonymous data?
Who do you think should keep? I think it depends whom it is. It's not independent of consent and awareness. In an ideal world, I know advocates who say the individuals themselves should keep it. Everybody should have their own data vault, and we will use automated policies and multi-party encryption and blockchain so that I can say when I want my data to participate and for what, and know how it was used. That is the people down, block away from me in CSAIL. They're the artificial intelligence and CS labs. I think that's the tech dream, right? The technocrat dream is we solve it all with algorithms. Everybody has complete control. There's also a little social science problem of mapping those policies to something that they can choose in an understandable way, right? How will they navigate through all of these policies and make these decisions? Obviously, they need a simpler mapping or an artificially intelligent agent that learns their preferences and allows. But given that doesn't exist, right? Having data in a place that I'm more comfortable when the ultimate data holder has some responsibility to me, when both legally and ethically, when I am their client and not somebody else, when I can. Not that I make all decisions, but that I can see what they have about me when I want to. I can challenge it if it's not right. And I can get some information about how not just what I agreed should be done with it, but what actually has been done with it. So it's about the life cycle of control, awareness, efficacy over the data, and also aligning the incentives. So not a simple answer. Yeah. Give it to the libraries. We like it. Here, you want a simple one? We'll do it for you. We're at least aligned with your interests.
No, actually, right now, it looks, every institutional data repository run by a library or other group that I have looked at actually explicitly says you may not deposit any data that has PII data in it, which right there is always like the fact that there could be any data set that doesn't have any PII, but since we're explicitly saying, and when we wrote for Mellon, this was part of what we investigated, and we could not find any library-based repository that would take PII data. So right there, we're repositing everything, unless. But that actually isn't the question I wanted to ask, where I wanted to at least bring into our discussion, because I feel like we're talking about non-private data as if the data about an individual is only ever about that individual. But so much of our data, especially I think in this networked world, when I expose my data, I actually expose somebody else's data because of my connections to them. And so I think it's not an easier situation, obviously, to think about, and I think there's a point at which we can't work ourselves into sort of a gridlock of we can't do anything because everyone's connected to everyone. But I think there's at least a level that we might need to think about what other people I'm exposing when I expose my own data, and it just comes back to some of the questions of like inform and consent. So how do we explain to people you're informing and you're kind of consenting for somebody else who you can't really consent for, but some of those things, I mean, obviously genetic data becomes an obvious one with that, but I think there's other kinds of data that expose connections that we need to think about beyond some of what we've talked about already.
I think you're right. You might, not to further complicate things, but you might think about the simplest case of that is where you have particular events in your database that actually involve multiple parties. You know that it's an email from X to Y involves both X and Y, right? That's clearly in your database. And so just having X give consent or Y give consent may not be adequate. Right? Same thing with a network connection from X to Y, a photograph that has multiple people in it. Right? All of these things have, at a second level, you might, and that in some ways is controlled at least a little bit by law. Right? If it was illegal to share identified information about X, it's probably illegal to, you probably have to take Y's name out as well. Right? Not necessarily, but at least that is sometimes in scope. Then there's the question about where an inference about X can give you a lot of information about Y, which is genetic, mostly in genetics. But if I know something about somebody's household, about you and you live in the same house, I know you live in the same household, that might be another. Where you actually have to start adding to your thinking information relationships that are not explicitly in your database. And then then you need to think about the systemic level effects and how it affects things like the market for privacy. If this is called, if we do things that affect others, this is an externality in economic terms. And we know that when there's an externality, that bargaining doesn't get us to the right solution, right? There's often a race to the bottom. There's another aspect of network effects going on in Facebook, which is that like this big collection is like the telephone system. Like having everybody's connections is so much more valuable than having like a small pool, that the bigger the network is, the more valuable it is. So you get this large value with the network and these externalities on the cost. And so yeah, the one equilibrium model is Facebook gets everything. And everybody consents to it, knowing that Facebook gets everything, because that's sort of where you've structured the incentives to lead.
Great. Well, all right. So, are we on? Okay. It says on, but maybe not. So thank you, Micah. I really appreciate the thoughts and the perspective here. And while Paul's getting set up, our next speaker, we're going to look at, come at this question from a slightly different perspective, one on security and privacy and trust, with Paul Burton, who is Professor of Infrastructural and Epidemiology at the University of Bristol. He also co-leads the Transdisciplinary Data to Knowledge Research Group. So get your slides up.
I will. And here we go.
Oh, there we go. There we go. All right,
Great.
Paul.
Lovely. Okay. So, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me to be involved in this. One of the things that I've noticed this morning is there really is a very consistent set of views amongst all the speakers about what many of the fundamental issues are, which I think is very refreshing. The way I'm going to deal with this now is, in fact, to take this forward a bit and actually give really some pragmatic examples of how we've actually implemented number of these ideas in two specific settings. One is in the actual pragmatics of releasing data from the large birth cohorts in the United Kingdom. And the second one is how we're developing particular methods, software-based methods for analysing confidentially the horizontally and vertically partitioned data that Micah was referring to. Okay, so this is weird. Okay, all right. So, well, the title I was asked to speak to was this security, privacy, and trust. And in one sense, perhaps the most important message to come out from what I'm going to say relates to what's actually in that title. First of all, it's clearly this is a complex challenge that involves science, technology, governance, and a range of other fundamental social issues. We therefore have to make sure we deal with all of those together. Whatever we find and however clever we may find individual solutions to particular problems, no single solution is going to be adequate to solve all the problems. And so when I talk later on about Data Shield, that has a particular area in which it's useful, but it does not solve by any means the vast bulk of problems that do exist in the field. True transdisciplinary programs of work are essential, and we, well, particularly Madeleine Murter, who co-leads the group with me, are very strong about the fact that when, for example, John was talking earlier on about labs collaborating, in fact, what we actually need to do for transdisciplinary collaboration is we need people from totally different backgrounds to work together. And for example, geneticists need to work with social scientists, need to work with informaticians. And that adds many extra levels of challenge. And finally, a point that's been made many times this morning is even the most complex and sophisticated of solutions is never going to offer a fully effective exploitation of available data with zero risk of mistakes in managing the data or of malign interference. So basically, we need to be upfront about that. Okay, or in part my philosophy that underlies how I see this has by chance, nothing to do with me, been reflected in what I view to be an excellent book that's been published in the last year by Mark Elliott and his group in Manchester. And basically, this is called the Anonymization Decision-Making Framework that's talking about how you might choose to try and move along the process of anonymization of data. And the key message this is a quote from their preface, is that their view has always been that anonymization is a heavily context-dependent process, and it's only by considering both the data and its environment as a total system, which they call the data situation, that you can come up with a well-informed decision about whether and what anonymization is needed. So basically, attempts to focus only on the data and whether or not that data may be disclosive will be inadequate unless we also think about the context in which those data are being held and dealt with. Okay, so the first part I'm going to move on to is basically the issue of why and when we might want to control access to research data. And the first question I want to address in that is that there is the term sharing of data is used very widely, but it's actually an ambiguous term. And just to illustrate that, first of all, if we think who might want to share research data, and as a minimum, there are two different groups. There's one situation where I, as a data generator, want my data to be used by research users, and they're going to apply to me to get access to that data. So that's clearly a form of data sharing. But there's another form of data sharing which is equally common, particularly in the genetics field, which is the issue of sharing data across a consortium. So a whole group of people all mutually agree to share their data. And although there's some parallel or some commonality between those two settings, they are different. Second thing is how, in practice, and I'm talking particularly from the biomedical health area, is sharing actually achieved? And there are a number of ways to do that. First of all, you can physically transfer the data to a user. Secondly, you can provide provide access to analyze the data. When data are particularly sensitive, people might require the analysis to actually be done on site in some sort of hotel facility. Basically, in many other settings, you want to provide remote analysis to a single data set. And then there's, in more general case, which is what I'll talk about in relation to data shield in particular, federated analysis, remote analysis of multiple sites with the data remaining in where they originally stood. And a key point is that all of these interpretations are valid and important, so we need to deal with all of them. We can't just think that only one of these applies. All right, so why do we want to control research data at all? And basically, in general, there are two broad reasons why we want to do this. So first of all, in almost all areas of scientific research, there's an issue of intellectual property that's been invested and is held in that data. People spend much of their lives collecting data and putting value adding to it, and therefore, in a sense, they might be reluctant to just simply hand that data out to someone else. The second big area, which probably in the health setting is probably bigger than the first one, is that legal, ethical, and other governance stipulations exist largely to protect the welfare of individual research participants. And there are two concerns here, which have been obviously talked about a lot this morning. There is the issue of disclosure of identity. Merely knowing that someone is in a particular data set can be a negative, can cause harm for that individual. And secondly, there's the disclosure of associated information from someone. Once you found out they're in a study, maybe a completely benign study with no meaning, you might then find that they have a particular problem that they wouldn't want people to know about. And the key point about controlling data access is that there's got to be a constant balance struck between these reasons for wanting to control the sharing and the clear societal benefits that arise from streamlined comprehensive data access, because this enables scientific research across the board to proceed much more quickly and effectively. And a point that again has been made several times this morning is that particularly the technological and the social issues that underpin this balance are evolving very rapidly with time, and in different social settings they vary as well, and we need to be able to take account of that complication. Okay, so just as a first step, when in the lifetime of data are they at risk of being disclosed? And this is a diagram from a paper that we published in Bioinformatics a year ago. And simply the reason for putting this up is it shows what we call the data pipeline, which is how data start off in a study. They're generated, they're captured and stored initially. They're put into a situation when they can be partitioned up into blocks that they might then want to be analyzed. We have integration for vertically partitioned data, so where we've got information coming from different sources on the same individuals that we want to pull together. Then there is the actual analysis process, and finally there is the archiving, permanent long-term storage, and then there's also the process of data discovery. However, there's another area where there could be a risk of disclosure, and this is the point where you take the knowledge that you've generated from the analysis and interpretation, and you basically want to disseminate that publication and for the development of evidence-based action. So all of these areas are places where there could be risk of disclosure. And in fact, I'm going to focus particularly, because these are the ones that affect me most, in situations in the middle of this, where basically we've got a block of data that either we're ready to just release it now, we're in a process where we're wanting to link it between different data sets, or we're in the process of analyzing it, and those data are being made available to a third party, and we want to, and there is therefore a risk that that third party could do something with those that we don't want them to do. All right, so there are a number of specific issues in relation to this that we ought to consider. So in relation to the data at any one point in time, then there are disclosure risks associated with how it's stored, how it's transmitted, and how it's actually used. So we need to be thinking about those things all the way along. It's worth noting, and again, this has been made, points been made several times already, and this is certainly my experience in relation to problems releasing data in the UK, that there is a difference between accidental and deliberate violations, and in fact, most of the violations of data that I've encountered have either been accidental or they've simply been because people haven't understood that they're not allowed to do what they think that they thought they could do. And a key point is the risks and remedies lie in the nature of the data themselves and the contextual environment in which the data should be used and potentially misused. So that this comes back again to this book by Eliot. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about, in practice, what's actually happening in relation to some of the big cohorts in the UK. So basically, I'm involved with 6 or 7 of the major birth cohorts in the UK. One of them is a project called Ausback, which is 14,000 individuals who've been followed from their mother, at the point their mother was first identified when pregnant in the early 90s. And that's called the Ausback project. In addition, I and also a number of other people, including Neil at the back, who's the deputy chair, we work on what's called the MetaDAC in the UK, which is basically it's a big data access committee that covers 6 and soon to be 7 of the major cohorts in the UK. And so just to illustrate in practice how we deal with things. So first of all, if we get an application to receive data, then we consider both the users and the application. So for example, we follow MRC guidelines, Medical Research Council guidelines, as to whether or not they can be viewed as bona fide researchers. And in considering the application, we focus particularly on things like, does it violate or potentially violate any of the ethical or other governance permissions granted with the study? And also, is there a risk that it may produce information that may allow individual cohort members to be identified? So one of the consequences of that, for example, is there are quite specific rules about geographical disaggregation, how far down we're willing to release data under different circumstances and how we will then protect it if we are going to do that. More generally, as I say, we have to think about managing the data and the data environment. And so all of these studies, the administrative and research data are held separately, basically because the administrative data obviously includes a lot of directly identifying information, and so the administrative and research data must be held in separate places. Obviously, there's things like hard copies of data held in locked storage, and electronic data is all held on password-protected systems with access restricted to those who really need it. All electronic data in all of these studies are held in encrypted form. A term which we may refer to as security is security of the quality of the study. And so all of the studies do extensive quality control to make sure that what actually is ultimately released and used is actually what it's meant to be. And there's also security of existence with multiple backups on multiple sites. In addition, in virtually all settings, data are pseudonymized before release, so we don't deliberately ever release anything which would be viewed as normally as being, for example, a linkage identifier. However, if, for example, that is impossible, and sometimes in one particular big study, there was a problem with, they wanted to study the genetics of lots of villages in the UK, and therefore you had to have geographical very fine-grained geographical data, which was therefore going to be hard to properly pseudonymize. And so in that case, the analysis was set up so that the people doing that had to do that in an air-gapped system in their own center, which was formally assessed by the people running the project itself. All data transfers for all of these studies are encrypted using standard protocols. Every time you have a new project, we release data on new study-specific IDs, because if you release them on the same study IDs, it makes it very easy for people to think that they can join up their data with the data down the lab, just down the corridor from another lab. And this is one of the things we've actually found as a specific problem that has emerged, where people think that must be reasonable and therefore they try to do it. And so we have to explicitly say they can't. And then there's this knowledge about no matter what we do, we can't guarantee a zero risk of disclosure. One of the other things happening in the UK that I think it's just worth mentioning is there's a group called the Expert Advisory Group in Data Access, which is run by 4 of our major biomedical funders, so Wellcome Trust, MRC, ESRC, and the Cancer Research UK. This group, which I happen to be a member on, came up with a basic report on the governance of data access in 2015. And there was another, if you want to see it, then it's easy to find through the Wellcome Trust web. And it came up with a number of recommendations, of which I think the most important are that governance must be proportionate and context appropriate. It must be transparent or auditable, and it must be possible to appeal against it. And there's this constant need to reflect this term trust. If any of these things are ultimately going to work, we really need to work on and help generate mutual trust and respect amongst all stakeholders. And so all of these reflect the need for a strong underpinning governance structure if we're going to do anything that makes these, the data in these studies adequately controlled. Just as an example of how we ensure that people who apply for data through the MetaDAC do not go away and do things that we don't want them to do. Here are just 2 statements from the application forms, either the form itself or the thing that are signed after once they've got the data accepted. So these include quite specific statements, such as applicants are reminded that the terms and conditions for the cohort explicitly forbid any attempt to identify individuals or to compromise or otherwise infringe the confidentiality of information on data subjects and their right to privacy. And secondly, do you understand that you must not pass on any data or samples awarded or any derived variables or genotypes generated by this application to a third party? The key point is that you've got to have very strong, good governance, because at the end of the day, technology can't ensure that everything is completely safe. Therefore, you've got to have rules and sanctions that you can operate if problems do actually arise. Okay, now, so I'm now going to move on to talk about what for me is the bit that I'm really interested in from a methodological perspective, which is I'm going to talk about the development of our program of research called DataShield, which is a software application that allows some of the privacy protected methods that we've been talking about. And so first of all, I'm going to answer the question that was sort of in part put into the material that I was given when I was asked to do the talk, which is what is the role of privacy protection in open science? And the key point is that when research data are very sensitive or are seen as having a particularly intellectual property value, can we develop technology-based solutions that facilitate access to those microdata by enhancing the privacy protection so that all the intellectual property and governance constraints are met in full while we lower the governance bar? So the point is that can we develop a technology so we can never get rid of the risk altogether, but can we lower the governance bar so that we can promote open science by speeding up and making it easier to get the government's permissions whilst maintaining enough safety in there so that you're not suddenly opening up a big door for risks of disclosure. Crucially, the things that I'm going to talk to you about now, so DataShield, should be seen as an additional component that must be applied on top of a data access and governance system that was already well-founded. If you were just to put DataShield on any old study, then it would be completely pointless because the major protections have got to be through the rest of the system, and then DataShield can add a specific value for particular problems when it's been put on top of that. And a key point another point from the EGDA report that I mentioned was that it emphasized sustainability. So whatever we develop as methodology here has to actually be sustainable in a realistic way going forward. Okay. So I'm going to start talking about DataShield. And I'm first of all going to talk about multi-site DataShield for horizontally partitioned data. So as Michael was saying, horizontally partitioned data is when you've got different sources contain the same data, so the same set of variables, for example, but on different individuals. And so, in a sense, this is very like the situation that occurs with classical meta-analysis. However, rather than working with the summarized results of the study, we're going to be wanting to try and work with the actual individual level data in each study, which offers a number of major benefits. So that's the setting that we want to do. And the question, so in fact, the data shield was actually first conceived in 2009 when at a meeting discussing, in fact, data harmonization, so nothing to do with data privacy, the question was raised that given that the microdata themselves are scientifically critical and yet are potentially sensitive, is there a way that we can ensure, if we want to co-analyze a number of studies, is there a way that we can ensure that the information that actually drives the analysis from each study can be obtained, whilst the data themselves never come outside the firewall that at each study, so that basically the data remain constantly invisible and not extractable behind the firewalls, and yet we're extracting the information that drives the analysis. And whatever does it emerge has to be non-disclosive. And in fact, there are two ways that you could do. One of them is encryption. And basically, in a sense, there's two issues here. There's trivial encryption, which is simply, for example, putting on a standard protocol for ensuring that when you transmit data, that it's adequately encrypted in case someone breaks into the line. And that's trivial because that's already well sorted out. Then there's non-trivial, which is basically the stuff that Micah was talking about, which is developing encryption routines with encryption and decryption that allow you to take information from here or pass things across from there to there so that you are in a position to do the analysis and yet nobody can ever see and understand the data from the other source. So that's one thing, so that's the encryption. Now, the other route, which is in fact the way that we primarily work on, is to ensure that what comes out of these studies are low-dimensional statistics. So basically, they're summary statistics of some sort or other that are not detailed enough to be disclosive. And in an ideal world, you want those to be what are called sufficient statistics. A sufficient statistic is a statistic that contains all the information about the analysis that you're wanting to do that's held in the original data, but is effectively, that has been summarized in a way which holds all of that information without being disclosive. Okay, so in a second I'm going to show you how that actually operates in practice. Having developed Data Shield initially for the multi-site setting, we then realized after a bit that if you've actually set up the systems that allow you to be able to an analysis computer to coordinate analyses in multiple sites, in fact, you can actually then pull this down to a single site. The same routines that we initiate in order to enable this to happen can actually just be applied to a single site. So this provides a very cheap, open source, freeware-based way to develop a secure data enclave. Okay, so how does it actually work then? So basically, here in a setting with 6 studies, and we've got an analysis computer. So let's imagine this is based in Bristol, my home place, my laptop, and I want to analyze these 6 studies scattered around Europe. Now, there are 3 basic settings that we encounter here. First of all, there are one-step analyses. So these are ones where basically you ask each study to do an analysis, which in a sense is in itself non-disclosive. It can therefore simply be passed to the center and combined in order to get the overall example, the overall result. So for example, one of these is the DS table 2D function, which basically requests a two-dimensional contingency table to be constructed. And basically all that happens is that the analysis computer sends out the instruction to each study, please create that table for your study, pass that table centrally. That table fundamentally is not disclosive with one rider that I'll mention in a minute. Therefore, we can then simply add those tables together in the center. The rider we have to add is that if you were to do this, if you were to approach a census organization, for example, and ask them to produce a table, they won't do so if one of the cells has a cell count, say, below 5 or increasingly below 10. And so we have systems in R, rather than the table function in R, our data shield table function allows us to set at the choice of the individual studies a threshold below which, if a cell is below that level, nothing will get returned from that study for that particular analysis. So that's the first thing. Those are one-step analyses. Multi-step analyses are ones where you have to send out one command to get an initial bit of information, which is then combined and then allows you to carry on and send out another command, which is then completed on all the studies. And one of the examples for this is the ds-lexis function, which is basically a function that divides survival time data up into a series of defined periods of time rather than the whole thing all being included at one. And one of the issues about that is that before you can actually work, you need to have the same time periods in each study. And until you know what the maximum time survival was for anybody in any of the studies, you can't do that. And therefore, the first command goes out, tell us your maximum survival time, and then send that centrally. That then allows you to send out the command to break up the data correctly. And another point to see immediately, the maximum survival time is in itself potentially somewhat informative. And so one of the things that we do in that case is that at first stage of the ds-lexis basically has a randomization addition to that in order to occlude, to slightly occlude the information about what the maximum survival time is in any study. Then the most interesting one is the iterative analyses. So basically many analyses in biomedical research can be expressed as generalized linear models. But generalized linear models are iterative procedures. And so what we wanted to know is it possible to fit an iterative procedure using data shield? And there's two ways that you could do that. The obvious way is you could simply ask the analysis computer to fit the model in each of the 6 studies and then combine the results. So that's effectively equivalent to a study level meta-analysis. But in addition, what you might want to do is to basically fit one iteration and then combine the information from the different studies to allow the analysis computer to work out what the next iteration should be. So basically do iterations across all studies, one after another simultaneously and in parallel. In fact, we can do both these approaches in Data Shield. And the next thing I'm going to show you is how this actually works in relation to the proper iterative thing that iterates across all studies simultaneously. So basically what happens for this is, the first step is that the analysis computer sends out a command to each of the studies that says, fit a generalized linear model, in this case it's a logistic regression model, and we're going to start off, as all generalized linear modeling statistics implementation do, with a guessed vector at what the final answer is going to be, and in this case it's guessing that all the regression coefficients are 0, and it says only fit one iteration. So basically those commands go out to each of the studies, they each fit one iteration, and from that they then return 2 summary statistics, or 2 sufficient statistics in fact. One's called the score vector, one's called the information matrix. And as you note, these are low dimensional, and these are not inherently disclosive in themselves, unless the model is a very, very big model, and we have protections built in to stop that happening. Those score vectors and information matrices are sent centrally, and happens to be that if the analysis computer then adds up all the score vectors and adds up all the information matrices, and then takes that sum of score vectors and divides it by the sum of the information matrices, then that's the standard way that you update the regression coefficients from one iteration to the next in a generalized linear model. And so basically having done that, we get the next guess at the beta vector, which gets sent out again to the computers, and they fit another iteration. To the studies, sent out another iteration, and that continues until it basically converges. And what we find with this is, so this is the data shield analysis for a logistic regression model, and the set of estimates and coefficient and standard errors we get from it. And this is the direct convention analysis, which is done by taking all the data, pooling it in a block centrally, and analyzing the data using a standard logistic regression. And the important point to note is that these results are identical. It's not that they're approximately the same, they are identical. The only reason that they're different is because of the number of figures that have been carried. And in fact, it's easy to show why they are identical, though people find it very hard to believe. We've written a paper about it. But if anybody wants to know, I can explain afterwards, because it is very straightforward. Okay, so in a sense, the statistics underpinning DataShield are relatively straightforward, in fact. The more important issue is how this could actually be implemented in practice. And the way that's done is that, so imagine these are 3 studies that we've been doing a lot of work with in our pilot data. And so that's a Netherlands study, that's in Finland, and this is one of the studies we run in the UK. So each of these studies contains their own data, obviously in their own data server somewhere, so that's fine, we don't want to touch that. What we do is, behind the firewall of each of those studies, we implement an Opal database, and the Opal databasing system is a MongoDB databasing system that can deal with things in SQL or no SQL formats. And basically, we put the data that we want to be shared between the studies into an Opal data table for each of the 3 studies behind the firewalls. What then happens is that the analysis client, so again, imagine this let's imagine this is Becca, because it's clearly not me, sitting in Bristol. In this case, we've elected to go through a common portal, which in this case was based in Groningen in the Netherlands, but you don't need that common portal. But we send the instructions to each of the studies. So the first instruction, if we were doing a generalized linear model, would have been that please send the command to do a single iteration and the initial vector. And basically, the first command in any DataShield in any DataShield analysis is to take the data that you want to share from the Opal data table and to transmit it into a data frame in that local R environment. So that's the first thing that happens. The data then sits there, and the analysis can then proceed. Now, how does the analysis work? So basically, we've actually got 2 types of R here. We've got a normal R session sitting on the analysis client, and so that's a quite straightforward thing. And then each of these R ones at the server, they're special versions of R that are embedded in their Opals. And the key point is that there is a parser that sits within that means that only only functions that we've developed and have put into that parser can be passed through. So basically, it means that the range of analyses you can do is completely specified, and in addition, the range of arguments you can put to those functions is specified. And then critically, those functions, which are called the server-side functions, also we've ensured, if we've taken a standard R function and have implemented it in DataShield, we've basically blocked off any disclosive output from those functions. A good example of that would be that the generalized linear model, if you fit a GLM function in GLIM, one of the things you automatically get out from that, or can get out from it, is the set of full set of regression residuals. Now, those are in fact inherently disclosive, so those are not allowed out for our functions. So basically, that's how we've set DataShield up for the horizontal case, and that works well. Okay, now just to finish off, I just want to talk about what we're now doing for vertically partitioned or linked data. And as Micah hinted at, this is actually a much more difficult problem. So again, in the same way that we originally developed the generalized linear modeling in the horizontal one because that was the key to a lot of other analyses that would work. Here we start off by thinking about a regression type analysis, because if you've got a regression, a set of explanatory variables and an outcome variable in a regression model, then the form that the regression coefficients take is a combination of matrices divided by another combination of matrices. And what those actually require is 2 variables, XA and XB. So let's imagine XA is from our study, Alsbach in Bristol, XB is coming from the NHS. Then we need to be able to do a matrix or a vector multiplication of those 2. And what that involves doing is taking the first element of the vector in ALSPAC with the first element of the vector in the NHS, adding to that the product of the next one, and so on. The key point is that at some point, if you're going to calculate this, you've got to have the XA and the XB together somewhere, but how can we do that without them actually being disclosable to wherever it is that they're actually going to be sitting? And in fact, the way we do this is we use encrypted matrices to hide what's actually happening. So just to show you, for example, what's happening, this is a very simple case. Imagine we wanted to multiply these two vectors, two short vectors, and basically if you did that, it would end up being, this would give it an answer 3, because basically every time you've got a 1 and a 1 together, it's scoring 1, otherwise it's scoring 0. And when you add them all up, it comes to 3. So you wanted to do some sort of analysis that's, in this case, going to give an answer 3. Now, there's two things that we actually have to do to do this, to produce encryption here. First of all, we need to have an encryption matrix. So this is simply, in this case, a random set of numbers in a 3x3 matrix here, and each one of these entries has been randomly developed from a uniform distribution between -10 and +10. Any other form of randomization would have been fine, but that's what we've used here. In a sense, the need for that sort of encryption is pretty obvious, as you'll see in a second. But in addition, there has to be a second form of occlusion, which arises from the fact that the vectors we want to multiply here are binary, and binary vectors, when you pass them on, even if you've occluded them, even if you've hidden them with the masking matrix, can be disclosive, because basically every time there's a 0 in this column, then the output that you're going to pass will always be 0, because 0 times anything is 0. So we get around that by hiding this with these two extra columns of, again, randomly generated numbers that we call the occlusion matrix. All right, so getting down to how this works then, what happens is that the analysis, the analysis computer basically, in this case, generates two of these matrices, one of which it sends to the Opal study and one of which it sends to this study. The Opal study takes the matrix that's been sent to it, and it calculates the matrix product of MA times the XA, which is of course the occluded matrix. So it's a matrix with 3 columns, not just the vector. Passes those to B, and because of the combination of the encryption matrix, the MA, and the occlusion with the two vectors, B is not in a position to interpret any of the original values of the 0 and 1 unless it was to find out what MA and the occlusion vectors were. B then multiplies the MA X transposed A by its XB and its masking matrix MB, and passes that product to the analysis computer. Now, critically, as soon as you do that calculation, the matrix function is collapsed. So basically, there's now only a very low dimensional thing there. So basically, even knowing what the MA and the MB are, no one is in a position to go back to work out what the XA and the XB were. So we've now got this encrypted thing, MA, XA, XB, MB, and the analysis computer now simply pre and post multiplies that by the inverses of the matrices that it originally had, and that basically then returns, in fact, a 3x3 matrix of which the central term is 3, which is the one that we want in this particular instance. So that's basically how this system works. Now, the development of this is lying far behind the development of the horizontal work that we're doing, partly because it is so much more complicated to do. But basically, we're basically very keen to work with groups in developing this. We're trying to find applications where this could be done so we could actually start doing this for real properly. Okay, so just to finish then, so this is the core data shield development team, which I have to thank. And basically we have Becca here, and we also have Dimitri. And finally, so in terms of the sorts of stuff we're discussing today, there are a number of opportunities during this week to see more about it. If you want to know more about Data Shield and our methods for secure data analysis. Then Becca is speaking tomorrow in the secure multi-party computation session. Dimitri's got a poster, which is poster number 12 on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We're actively involved, particularly Becca's been actively involved in the Working Group for Data Security and Trust. So that's the session on the 17th of September. And then these are our contact details. And finally, one of the things that we're wanting to do, which I think fits very well with what we've been doing today, is that we've recently run a workshop in Bristol that was funded by the World Universities Network. And one of the things that came out from that, and then from an international meeting about record linkage that took place in Swansea, is that there are a whole series of issues about what are the real issues here. If data are available under particular circumstances, when does that matter? When does it not matter? What should we really be concerned about? And one of the things that we think needs to happen in the health setting, in health data setting, is that we need a professional to build a big professional group that actually deals with all these things together. And we're just trying to pull together this at the moment with the group called Dashing Data Sharing for Health Innovation Group. And this is clearly something we wanted to do with the RDA. And anybody who wants to indicate an interest in this, then this is if you go to this website, you can find out what's happening. Okay, I finished.
Any questions?
Okay, so I kind of have an odd question here because the talks so far today have been making me think about terms like research data, which as far as I can tell, there isn't any such term. It's just data, period. It might be research in that role today, but it might be a different kind of data tomorrow.
Yeah.
Or vice versa. But you had this concept of bona fide researcher, and that was another term that I thought was pretty well fraught.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
And so I was going to ask, what in the UK do you mean by a bona fide researcher?
Okay, so first of all, in terms of answering your first question, the reason in the UK that we talk about research data is, in fact, it's not that research data itself is defined, but that a large part of the data infrastructure in the UK is viewed as being either administrative or health-based data that is there primarily to help, in the case of health data, the patient. So basically there's a very strong view at the NHS level that one of the reasons that they need to have data is to directly help the care of individual patients. And there are a number of settings where they're quite happy for data to be used for that, whereas they wouldn't be happy for exactly the same analysis to be done for the purposes of what a researcher would view as research. So that's the reason why I'm mentioning the term research data. But I agree with you that the concept of research data per se, in fact, it's not really necessary in relation to understanding this, apart from the fact that it's part of the title of today's session. And I agree with you that what counts as research data in one setting will count as actual operational data in another setting. So I think it is a fine point. In relation to, sorry, I've forgotten remind me of the other question because I will.
What's a bona fide research?
Oh yeah. So all right. So the reason that's been developed is that that concept is developed is that historically one of the reasons why we've developed the MetaDAC in the UK, which follows on from another access committee which originally only covered just one study, was that one of the problems that we find is that PIs, principal investigators of some of these studies were extremely restrictive in what they would reward. So basically they had all sorts of reasons why they wouldn't release data in a given setting, some of which were valid and some of which were not. And basically it was perceived that what we needed to do was to move away from PIs having the say on what data was used and to a setting in which an all-purpose committee did it. And a key part of that was moving away from the idea of doing scientific review of applications, because scientific review of applications, in my view, is appropriate when you're talking about a depletable resource. So if you're talking about blood samples, where if this particular person does this analysis, it's going to end up using the whole of these blood samples up. That then has to be refereed and dealt with appropriately. But most of the time with data, our view is that you shouldn't be addressing you shouldn't be trying to assess the science. The person putting the application in is likely to know just as much about that science, in fact more about that science than you as a research access committee are likely to do. So we want to move away from that. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought again now. Oh yeah, and so one of the key things that we therefore needed to move to was what are the issues about someone coming along with an application that we need to take account of. One of the other problems in many of the cohorts in the UK, and there's also, I think, true in other countries, including the States, is that the wording of consent forms often precluded certain groups from actually using the data. So, for example, the 1958 birth cohort actually has a statement that says these data will only be shared with other researchers in this field. Now, we've managed to go a long way down the route of generalizing that so that it's not too tightly incorporated. But one of the things that we do have to have is this term bona fide researcher, because there are other groups that we wouldn't want to do it, like, for example, insurance companies, the police. If the police want to do it, they have to go through a court order route. And so that's the reason that we use the term bona fide researcher. There is a formal definition used by the MRC. I have to say I can't actually say what it is, but the reality is that we have never, I've been involved with this project this particular project for 12 years now, and at no point have we ever had to actually make a judgment on that. But it's the same system as used, as Neil will be able to tell you, in Sanger, for example. The Sanger Centre also uses a similar system. But I agree, it's not.
If we can turn this into more of a conversation. So more than 12 years ago, I introduced this term into the genetics research, which I got from a study in America in the first place. I was looking around for a form and found it. But effectively what we've operationalized it to mean is that when you're putting forward your email addresses, it has to be a real one from an institution and not just a Google address you might have made up. Yeah, and also that it has to be an institution that is recognized so that we know that you have written something about this before and you're not just making it up on the hoof. So that was kind of the operational aspect of what a bona fide researcher meant.
Okay, so
Not everyone who needs to be there now.
along that line, so I'm going to use an example from one of the examples he gave. So you did a study about genetics in villages. And it was a small village, and that village got together and went, we're interested in the results of that study, and we'd like our data. Would they be considered bona fide researchers? Since after all, it's their data.
Yeah, okay, but I can give you, basically I can give you, this is my own view on that. Basically, one of the things that I think is really critical about a system that can be based on the sort of access committee that we have is that it's basically almost like common law. It develops its policies as it goes along, okay? Now, and what would be counted, in fact, what would have counted as being a reasonable applicant 12 years ago would be different now, quite often. My view is in that instance, I actually think they should be able to get hold of it. And basically that would be, if that was discussed at a committee, that's what I would say. I have no idea whether everybody else would agree or not, but that would be my position. And what I would say is that many of these questions don't have a correct answer. I mean, should those people be allowed to have it or not is a general question, not related to how you define a bona fide researcher. It's a much more fundamental question than that. And I think that we have to be careful not to paint ourselves into corners. And one of the things, in fact, that we've gradually been unraveling over the last 12, 15 years is that there were a lot of very specific statements that were made when the original data were collected that are completely ambiguous, are very contextually different to what they were before. And basically, I think it's important that we do try to deal with these in a flexible but a rational manner going forward, that you can then justify. 'Cause I mean, it's coming back to what was said earlier. At the end of the day, I want to be able to say, and the committee wants to be able to say that we have done this in good faith. This is the best that we believe we could have done under these circumstances. And at the end of the day, there's not going to be a formal definition of a bona fide researcher that will satisfy everybody, but nevertheless that I've operationalised that in the way that I think is appropriate.
Okay,
Well, and
cool.
one thing that I'd like to add to that is you can set up a set of rules or a framework for rules for providing access or limiting access. But you can always build into that set of rules some flexibility for outliers, or how do you deal with an edge case that doesn't limit the value of setting up those, common sense rules that work 80 or 90% of the time. So I think having a system that defines things like, a bona fide researcher, that allows for kind of policy decisions to be normalized, and then you focus your attention on those outliers rather than the 80 or 90% of the time that you get we've got a researcher coming in from Kansas or UC Denver. Okay, just let them through, or let them go through this one procedure and automate that and simplify it. And then focus the policy questions on those kind of more nettlesome questions about, well, these people aren't technically, but they've done X, Y, Z. I mean, I don't personally qualify as a researcher, but I do a lot of publishing, so.
Yeah, sounds familiar.
There's actually a specific example that really illustrates a lot of these points, which is that one of the major challenges for many big cohorts at the moment is how you feed back information. If you find that someone's got a genetic variant that is potentially clinically relevant to them, for example, BRCA1 would be an example. Do you want to be able to pass that information back? Now, the reality is, shows the change in context. When the 1958 birth cohort did its biomedical review, at that point, the general view, the international advice was that you should not hand any information back to individuals, because at the time people didn't know enough about what the individual variants might be. Secondly, because they were based on a relatively small number of variants that existed, you tended not to get the causal variant, and so the effects were small. And so the 1958 birth cohort and a number of other studies had this rule: at no point will we ever feed back any results relating to genetic variants. Now, the reality now is that with sequencing, we often can get the actual causative SNP. It can have major clinical things, and you would want to find out. And so we've had to develop mechanisms that allow us to bring that flexibility in, even though we know that the rules as specified are pretty clear and quite straightforward, and that we're doing things that appear to go against those rules sometimes.
Cool. Yeah, so just to give a little context for why I ask these kinds of questions, it's because I work with the ILOCA, the Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic. In other words, almost always with very small communities of indigenous people and their knowledge. And we've actually gone so far as it's never our data, it's always theirs.
Well, see, I strongly agree that that's a problem. And in fact, one of the reasons that we've been developing Data Shield, though it's not been implemented in this way so far, is that because it's been thought about in relation to research in Africa in particular. H3 Africa, which is one of the big initiatives at the moment, if you set up systems to develop biobanks in Africa and So they spend an awful lot of local resources to develop this work. They want that, want the science from that to be made available internationally, but they don't want to actually just hand their data over, because as soon as you do that, you then get in the position that you do, that you're never allowed to see it, they're never allowed to see it again, and the people who they've handed it to go away and get all the grants and stuff from it. And so I strongly believe that in many settings, the concept of making data available for analysis, but without releasing the data itself physically, and trying to do things to control the range of analyses that could be done such that you minimize the risk of inferential disclosure. It seems to me that that provides a way for much enhanced collaboration in many settings, one of which is with groups that are coming from resource-poor areas where it's hard to get the funding to do things.
Yep, and I guess I agree with you on that. And actually, I should note that we tend to publish with them as, in some cases, first authors.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Well,
But I also have to note that they don't like the word science either.
no, I worked in Australia for a bit in a child health research institute, which did quite a lot of work with the Aboriginal groups there, and many of the same issues and challenges existed in relation to that.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate the talk, and this has been a great morning, I think. We now have time for lunch. We are scheduled to go till 1:45. I'm just all messed up in my time schedules. We have... Right. Christine, you're on at 1:45. After lunch. So, okay. So we have time for lunch. Lunch is outside. We have a bag lunch of... I think there's any other logistical comments apart from we'll reconvene in about 40 minutes, 35 minutes? No? All good? All right. So, again, we will... bounce off the live stream and reconvene that or restart it at in 40 minutes or 35 minutes. So we'll see you all. Those of you watching on the screen will be bounced back. Thanks. Do you have a thumb drive?
I do, but that is a really dangerous thing to do. Viruses. Our security people